Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the National Landcare Conference 2021, the Environment and Climate Change stream. Now, I would like to please suggest that you submit the questions to the question box that you see on the screen. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Lucy Commander from the Australian Network for Plant Conservation. Now, over to you, Lucy. Please start your session.
Thanks so much for that lovely introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Lucy. I work for the Australian Network for Plant Conservation. I'm actually based in Perth in Western Australia on Wajak Noongar Budja. And today I'd really like to talk to you about the project that I've been working on recently, SEED, Getting Back to Landcare's Roots. So for something so tiny, native seed certainly packs a lot of punch. It is one of the fundamental ingredients for Landcare. Pretty much anyone doing tree planting, revegetation, restoration, direct seeding is likely to use seed in some form. So to help us best use this really precious resource, it's really important to have best practice guidelines. And ANPC has just recently updated the FloraBank guidelines, which are the best practice guidelines for native seed collection and use. And we're really encouraging anyone who works with native seeds, even if they don't even touch a seed, they're involved in policy making or licensing, to please check out the guidelines and have a look what they're about. So when do we need seed? Well, in some cases, seed actually isn't required to do revegetation or restoration or conservation. So sometimes just removing the threats might enable natural regeneration. So such as fencing to exclude grazing, for example, if the area's already got enough seeds in the seed bank or plants can resprout. But if the land has been cleared or it's highly degraded, then inputs are probably going to be required to replace these missing species or increase their numbers. So in some cases, different techniques are actually needed for different species. So some species might return through wind dispersal or maybe bird dispersal, but others are best replaced through seed and maybe others through planting. And in some cases, if plants don't produce many seeds, then you might even need to do cutting, propagation through cuttings as well. So we also really recognise the importance of ex situ conservation to support in situ conservation. So these are things like seed banking and nursery propagation, as well as living collections as well. This is a bit of a detailed look at the seed supply chain, and that really starts off with thinking about which species and which collection locations to get the seeds from. And then that works sort of all the way through to implementation. And what's really interesting about the seed supply chain is sometimes seeds don't actually change hands at all along this supply chain. So for example, maybe a landowner might collect seeds on their own property, they might propagate them, or they might do direct seeding on their own property. And so the seeds don't actually change hands at all, but in other cases, they might change hands many times. And this is really important because it's really important to have really good record keeping so that if seeds change hands, for example, from a collector to a testing facility, to a seed bank, to a native plant nursery or a Landcare nursery, then you need to make sure that those records about where those seeds have come from are kept and then passed on to the next person. And the FloraBank guidelines really goes through this whole seed supply chain, all the way from thinking about which species and where to get them from, through to collecting, production areas, processing and testing, as well as drying and storage, nursery prop, planting or seeding. And then the final part about monitoring, reporting and adaptive management, I think is also really important, because restoration or revegetation doesn't end when the seed or the plant is put in the ground. David Lindemeyer talked this morning about how important that long-term monitoring is. And I know that farmers are really used to doing adaptive management. So really important to make sure that you know not only how many plants you put in the ground, but how many survived and how many have reproduced. So there are a lot of questions with native seed management. For example, like which species are you going to be planting? Where are you going to get the seeds from? How much seed do you need? A little bit, a lot? How many kilograms? How many numbers? Do you need a license? And if so, which one? What sort of quality have you got? How do you store them until you need them? Should you pre-treat them? How do you sow them? There's just a lot of different questions. And also there will be probably different answers depending on the context, the location and the species as well. So that's why we really need best practice guidelines. That's where the FloraBank guidelines comes in. Now, this set of around 10 guidelines was written in about 1999, 2000, And initially it was a partnership between Greening Australia, CSIRO Forestry and Forest Products through Australian Tree Seed Centre and the Australian National Botanic Gardens. And these are a really great set of guidelines. I mean, I've certainly been using them for my whole career. But, you know, since the first edition, there's been over 20 years of experience and on-ground management and a lot of research on all of these topics. So that's why we are due for an update. So the Healthy Seeds project, which is being run by the ANPC, was lucky enough to be able to get some funding from the New South Wales government through its Environmental Trust to update the FloraBank guidelines. So firstly, for the Healthy Seeds project, we have a consortium of 7 organisations as well as ANPC. And we have updated these FloraBank guidelines to produce a 2nd edition, and these will be available for free from the end of August. You can log on to the florabank.org.au website when it goes live at the end of August, and they'll be available as a free download. So I'm just going to step you through a bit of the content of the guidelines and the process as well that we use for the update. So first of all, we formed a reference group. I listed all the modules that were in the initial guidelines, and some of them we merged and some of them we split, and then we also developed a bunch of new. So we've now gone from 10 modules to 15. We invited a whole lot of authors and over 45 of them said yes, which was really great. So we had a lot of input from a lot of different people and a lot of different sectors as well. We drafted the modules and then we invited some reviewers. So a few of the authors that weren't people we invited to the authors that just didn't have time or weren't available during that period actually reviewed for us, which was great. And then I sent everything back to the authors to address the reviews. We proofread and then sent to production. Now it's back from the graphic designer. Looks really great. The photos are amazing. And I'm really happy about how many people have been involved in this update process. And it's been a really rigorous process to have it authored and reviewed and proofread. So I'm really grateful for everyone who has helped out and been really generous with their time and also that sharing their knowledge. Now, this is the structure of the guidelines, this 2nd edition. So first of all, we have 4 modules that basically sort of are overarching the whole set of guidelines. These as an introduction, then working with Indigenous Australians, approvals, principles and standards and record keeping. And then modules 5 to 14 basically goes through that seed supply chain that I outlined earlier, from sourcing, collection, production, processing, drying and storage, through to quality testing, germination and dormancy, seed enhancement, nursery prop and direct seeding. And then finally, module 15 is about buying and selling seeds. So these are really tips for people who want to buy seeds and aren't really sure where to start, or they want a bit of a checklist just to make sure. And it cross-references back to all of the other modules. So you can go back and read for more detail as well. So I'll just give you a bit of an outline of some of the key points that we have from each of these 15 modules. So firstly, in module 1, the introduction, we talk about how important it is to have detailed restoration planning informing species selection, which then informs seed collection. If you don't know what your restoration or revegetation targets are, or the goals of what you're trying to do for land management, it makes it really difficult to know which seeds to go out and collect. The 2nd module talks about permissions and partnerships with Indigenous peoples. And the 3rd one talks about relevant licenses for seed collection and why it's really important to make sure that you have the correct licenses. And also, if you're purchasing seeds, making sure that the people that you're purchasing them from also have the relevant licenses. Number 4 is about record keeping. And it's so important to keep records for every part of the seed supply chain. And if the seed changes hands, then transfer those records over. So those records might be like a GPS location for where the seeds have been collected. It could be a date as well. You know, you want to know, are the seeds, were they collected last year or 5 years ago or 10 years ago? Maybe how they've been stored as well. Has it been in a shed at, you know, ambient conditions? Has it been in a freezer or a cool room? So keeping all of those details really tells you a bit about the quality of the seed as well. So then moving on to module 5, it talks about seed sourcing and about how there are different options for seed sourcing. If you've got large local populations near to your restoration site, you may be able to source your seeds from the local provenance. But, you know, if the vegetation is fragmented, if there aren't any local populations, then you might need to have a mixed approach. So combining local plus non-local or non-local sources. And I guess one of the key points as well is sourcing seed from many well-spaced plants across the population to capture greater genetic diversity, rather than just collecting from one tree or two. Trying to collect from as many plants as you can will increase the genetic diversity, and then that increases the resilience of the population. Module 6 talks about tips for collecting, when, how much, methods and equipment. And then Module 7 is talking about seed production and how this can help increase seed for restoration. There's a lot of benefits. There are some downsides. How do you source founding material, and what different types of design and growing systems can you use? Then Module 8 talks about how you process seeds to process them to extract the seeds. So whether that's, taking the seeds out of eucalyptus capsules, whether it's taking things out of pods, things like that, making sure that you separate the seed from the non-seed material. This reduces the bulk for storage. Also talks a bit about pre-storage drying as well, which then leads into Module 9 about how you need to store seeds under dry conditions at constant cool temperatures. Because the storage conditions, so that is relative humidity and also temperature, they determine the storage time. So, that module talks about think about how long you want to store the seed for, and that will determine the conditions that you can store, that you should be storing them under. Or conversely, what conditions do you have, and that will determine how long you can store them for, so that they're not aging in storage. Module 10 is about seed quality. So testing quality so that you can calculate the seeding rates. So if you've got, 5 viable seeds per gram, you're going to have a really different seeding rate to if you've got 100,000 viable seeds per gram, for example. And also make sure that you are actually using live seeds in seeding, or even in nursery production as well, because it would be really disappointing to go through all that effort of seeding or planting and then have nothing come up. Module 11 talks about testing seed dormancy, testing seed germination, and also some tips on overcoming seed dormancy, if that is relevant for the species that you're working on. Seed enhancement technology is really interesting, and it's a really new field of study, and there's a whole lot of different techniques that are really specialised but really interesting to read about. So these include coating, priming, pelleting, acid digestion and flash flaming, and these are all about sort of changing the physical structure of the seeds to help them go through direct seeding equipment, for example, or adding chemicals into the seed coat. I guess people who are used to working with agricultural seed will understand a lot about seed enhancement technologies, but this is actually quite a new field for native seeds and around the world. So that's a really interesting read. Module 13 talks about tube stock, when to propagate, which species you might want to propagate and how. And then Module 14 is about direct seeding. What machinery should you use, and when and how could you do that? And as I said, Module 15 is talking about top tips for seed purchases and seed purchasing, and also calculating value for money from your seed purchases as well. So also in the Healthy Seeds project, Martin and I are working on a roadmap, which is a strategic plan to improve native seed supply for restoration in New South Wales. So there's 2 parts to this. And firstly, Martin's done an investigation to learn more about the barriers and opportunities in the New South Wales seed sector. And then secondly, we're writing a roadmap to provide recommendations to improve seed supply. Now, we're in the middle of developing this roadmap at the moment, and we'll be doing some stakeholder consultations. So if you live in New South Wales, or if you have an interest and you live in another state, please get in touch with me or Martin, and we will add you to our list of stakeholder consultation. So here are a few of the barriers to seed supply that we've kind of identified through the first round of consultation. There seems to be lack of clarity and quite a bit of complexity around seed licensing, a bit of a lack of coordination at state and regional levels in terms of seed supply. There's been a decline in seed availability, or supplies not coordinated. Short-term variable and investment in seed production areas for a variety of reasons, and also an inability to attract, train and retain staff as well. So we've come up with 5 categories of recommendations to overcome these barriers. So firstly, we feel that coordination for seed supply and demand, planning restoration and identifying seed-related infrastructure, as well as two-way communication of research and management, is really critical. The second one is under sort of licensing and record keeping, and taking a look at licensing systems to make sure that they're fit for purpose. They're efficient, effective, and also we're thinking about some minimum standards for seed collection and some record keeping systems to provide data to the buyer. In terms of project management, it's really important that restoration projects and funding models especially incorporate the time required for seed sourcing and propagation. I'm sure you all know that it's really challenging to do a project if you've only got annual funding, because sometimes it can take a whole year to source the seeds for that project. So I think we need to make funders aware of the timelines that it takes, when we're working with biological material, and also climate variability. Even if you want to go out and collect seeds, some years maybe they're just not available for whatever reason. Now, in terms of restoration planning, we feel it'd be really good to plan restoration and seed requirements regionally to forecast these requirements, developing vegetation guides for each region as well to make sure that we've got species lists available for people to use, and also identify the regional infrastructure and see if there are any gaps as well and any needs. And finally, training, initiating and implementing a sector-wide training program in seed literacy to improve restoration community capacity. And this is for everybody in the sector really, but particularly also for the seed purchasers. Now, the FloraBank guidelines complements other ANPC publications. So ANPC publishes a quarterly bulletin for members. It's really interesting. It's got lots of pictures. So if you're a member, then you will receive that quarterly. It's a great read. The Plant Germplasm Conservation in Australia, the third edition is going to be launched in September. My colleague Amelia Martin-Jensen is heading that up. Last year, we published the Australian Native Seed Survey report. That's available on our website to download for free. So if you're interested in reading more about barriers and opportunities and also about the sector, please take a look at that. And a couple of years ago, we published the guidelines for translocation of threatened species in Australia. So if you're working with any sort of threatened plants, I would really recommend you check that out. That's also a free download as well. Now, our publications are also showcased at various ANPC events. So, for example, Amelia's the third edition for the germplasm guidelines is going to be showcased in the Australian Academy of Science Vienna Conference on the Environment. And that's going to be free and online on the 9th of September. So if you're interested in threatened species and plants that are difficult to store, seeds that are difficult to store, tune into that. We are planning some plants going places, threatened species translocation workshops in Melbourne, Ballarat and Bairnsdale in Victoria next year. And if you live in any of those places and you're interested in threatened plants, please get in touch with me. And also ANPC has a biennial conference we're hoping to hold in Albury next year. So please sign up to our e-newsletter or follow our socials to receive more information about these. And just finally, ANPC's also had input into Project Phoenix, which is a project funded by the federal government to build and secure native seed and plant supply for landscape restoration, recovery and resilience in bushfire affected areas and also other vulnerable landscapes. So I've written 3 of the reports, which are available online, and these reports have helped inform the National Native Seed Strategy. So if you're interested in international restoration systems, or looking at seed movement, so making tracks, where does seed come from, where does it go, is talking about record keeping and how to transfer records from user to user. And then there's also a picture of the Australian seed sector as well. And also the international restoration systems also talks about some financial models and some sort of economic drivers for restoration as well that could be used potentially in Australia. So check that out if you're interested.
One more minute, please.
That's perfect timing. That's pretty much the end of my talk. I just want to acknowledge the funding from the New South Wales Environment Trust, who have enabled us to do the Healthy Seeds project. Thank you to all of FloraBank authors for volunteering their time. Their names are so tiny because there were so many amazing people who've helped out. Also the reviewers, the ANPC staff and committee, Joe, Christine and Amelia, have helped Martin and I out enormously, as well as the whole committee, and thanks to Tony and Dave, who head up the committee. So please connect with the ANPC. You can visit our website. You can email me, florabank@anpc.asn.au. You can follow us on Twitter or Facebook. And our e-newsletter just comes out once a month. So I promise we won't spam you a whole lot. And you can just subscribe to that for free, even if you're not a member. But if you'd like to be a member and support our plant conservation work, that would be wonderful. So really sad that I can't be in Sydney to meet a whole lot of people, but please feel free to get in touch. Thanks.
Now keep the slides there, please, Lucy, because a number of people are interested in your slides.
Yep.
Now, whatever the process is between the, I'm just a volunteer here, virtual doorkeeper. So that for the people, please record the email addresses and that sort of stuff to get in touch with you. Now, to the questions.
Yes.
A number of comments and thank yous, so that's fantastic. And question from Kate. Hi Lucy, such important information, thanks. What equipment would a small local group need to start collecting, storing, etc.?
That is a really good question. And we have put a whole list of equipment in the FloraBank guidelines. We have put equipment for small local operators, as well as more experienced or larger organisations as well, who are wishing to kind of upskill or improve on their practices. So in terms of seed collection, it really would be best to just read the, and I'm sorry, they will be out so soon. But what you need is equipment for seed collecting. So that's buckets and calico bags. You need somewhere to dry your seeds. So you need to make sure that you have a shed that's not humid, or an indoor area. You can make sure that they're protected from rats and mice so that you don't have any predators coming in. And then you need to have somewhere to store your seed for the short to medium term. So somewhere that's cool and dry. That's the absolute minimum. I would recommend that you invest in a dissecting microscope. You can actually just put you can actually build like a perspex stand, and you can put a mobile phone on that to make a microscope. And invest in some small dissecting equipment. You can just get like a student toolkit, for example, like with some scalpels, just so you can cut your seeds open and have a look. So that's really the absolute minimum that we would suggest. And then there's a whole lot of other things as well. Oh, and a balance as well, making sure that you've got a balance. Even kitchen scales, if they are accurate to 1 gram, that's better than nothing, so that you can weigh the seeds that you've got, and if you can get a 2 or 3 point sort of balance, then that's great too. But there's so much more information in the guidelines, so please do have a look.
Fantastic. Now Tess is asking, how can we practically implement this guidance with such short-term funding cycles in NRM projects? Best practice and the get-it-done nature of projects are often fundamentally misaligned.
Look, people, I know, and I've been responsible for helping put together the technical side of the guidelines. And yes, it is a constant frustration, and it's very difficult when you recommend to people that, they try and plan their seed forecasting maybe 1 to 2 years in advance, and the funding doesn't allow for this. So all I can suggest is take the FloraBank guidelines to your funding body and show it to them and say, here is the best practice advice that tells us this is the amount of time that we need. So therefore we need more time. And I'm really sorry, I'm not a funding body, so I can't change the rules, but we are providing the best practice advice, and we're hoping that people can take this to funding bodies to show evidence that more time is required, and also time for monitoring and follow up as well, because I know if you've only got a year to do a project, how are you supposed to do long-term monitoring to actually see if what you did is effective, and are not just about how many seeds or how many trees you put in the ground, but how many actually survived and survived to maturity. So yeah, it's critical, and I'm really sorry that I can't be of more help with that.
Cool. No worries. Now 2 comments. First is, Lucy, your presentation is wonderfully clear and logical. Could you make your PowerPoints available to delegates? So that's that. And then
they go on the Landcarer platform. Is that correct? Everything's been recorded today.
Okay.
I think they're going to be available online to watch later.
And if they're not, then Gary is asking, please repeat the email address for Lucy. So the email address is on the screen. Is that correct, Lucy, your email address? Cool.
FloraBank@anpc.asn.au. Otherwise, look up the ANPC website and you'll find all of our addresses there.
Fantastic. And we've got 2 last question. Thanks, Lucy. Firstly, love your top. Secondly, can you expand on, is there guidance on restrictions of what and how much native seed you can collect at one time out on site?
Yes, I think it's about 20 to 30%. You should only collect around sort of 20 or 30% of what is currently available. So don't go through and rape and pillage the landscape, because there won't be any left for organisms that require seed to live, and also to put back into the seed bank, because that's really important to leave some for the environment. Now, the difficulty is, so if you're a local landowner and you're working on your own land and you're collecting from your own land and you collect that sort of 20%, then that's fine. What happens, however, if there's 4 or 5 seed collectors that are actually collecting in the same patch and they all collect 20%, that adds up to a lot more. So I think it's really critical. That's why we're kind of advocating for networks and coordination within regions, and also licensing to be fit for purpose, to actually see where are people collecting, which species are they collecting from and how much, so that there isn't an issue of over collection. Because obviously if too much seed is collected, it's not going back into the environment. Those seed banks aren't, those soil seed banks aren't being replenished. So I guess it's really about making sure that you know who the other collectors are and who's accessing that land, so that you don't take too much seed.
Fantastic. Now, unfortunately, we don't have time for the final question, but I just want to say that the slide, someone commented, Melanie, that slides will be available later today on the conference website. Yesterday's slides are there now. So that's just for the record. And now, thanks very much, Dr. Lucy. It was awesome and very informative. Thank you, everyone, for asking your questions, and Lucy for answering the questions. And now I would like to encourage all participants to please go back to the panel, because to join the final session. So, okay. So yeah, thanks, and have a good day.